Hi everyone. So over the last week you may have noticed I've been taking part in Childhood Week. I didn't really explain it or go into detail on day one, so that's what I'm going to do now. I only found out about Childhood Week a day into the event, so I've been playing catch up ever since Monday. But when I heard the concept, I just had too many ideas to wait another half a year for the next one. So Childhood Week was invented by Beatrice Blue, an artist over on Instagram, and it's a biannual event where she comes up with prompts and you create an illustration reminiscent or inspired by events from your childhood. My Artist of the Week at the end will feature an artist I followed through this first go of the challenge, but basically most artists focus on very personal memories of their own childhoods. And maybe I'll do that next time, maybe later this year. I'm not really sure what will take me, but for me, a large part of my childhood was books. Specifically going to the library and picking up new things to read every week with my mum. That evolution of reading with and then to someone, I feel like it's a really important and special thing to do. Just to read to your children, and to me it's a big part of my childhood, so I wanted to follow through Childhood Week with memories of the different worlds and places that I visited through the books I loved as a kid. On day one, the word was magic. Unlike Roald Dahl with Quentin Blake or Beatrix Potter's illustrations, that both are really an integral feature of the writing, I kind of don't relate J.K. Rowling to a specific illustrator, other than probably the original UK front covers of those books, which I do like, but I also don't like, if that makes any sense. I guess I'm trying to say I like the details of those illustrations, but it maybe doesn't look exactly how I imagined it personally. Whereas with the other two artists I mentioned, it's like the drawings become the way you imagine those stories. And I do find it odd such an important new childhood book doesn't really have a clear illustrator, or at least to me. And I don't know, it just gives me a little performance anxiety trying to capture those books. I think it's also because they mean so much more to me. I was that lucky age where I got to grow up the same age as Harry as the books came out, so the change in tone and feel has always felt like it resonated a lot with the age I was at the time, and part of me feels it's a shame that kids aren't almost forced to read it at those same ages like I was growing up with it. Just the idea that you can read them all at 7, I don't know, I guess it just feels like you won't be able to relate to being an older teenager the first time you read it, and really you'll only get those feelings on a reread. Or maybe not, but maybe you won't have time as well to guess the mysteries and dwell on the ideas like you could if you had to wait a couple of years for the next one. I don't know, I think there's a lot to having to wait for something because of the way I first read them, and I guess that is a large part of it for me. When I planned this piece, I knew I wanted to take a scene that was so traditionally witchy and magical, but playing it from that world and Hermione brewing the polyjuice potion in the girls' bathroom, using these Kuretake watercolours meant that I could play far more with brighter colours than I've previously been able to, and so I really took advantage of this in this and quite a few of the other pieces. I also on a general point wanted the paints to look intertwined, all from the same series I guess, and so I set myself materials and boundaries, and I tried to imagine each piece within those limits. With that idea of the illustration being just one box on the watercolour page, almost like a page from a book, I knew I wanted to break the format somewhere in that illustration, so with Hermione, the bubbles from the potion and the sides of the edges of the cauldron protrude from that box. I wanted them to feel like they were closer to the viewer, and also that the magic was escaping the confines of this illustration. And I tried to continue this theme throughout, so when it comes to day 2, when the word is tempting, I thought about, well, why would I break the edges of this painting? So tempting reminded me of Alice for multiple reasons. Firstly, the white rabbit tempting her down the rabbit hole, but then really throughout the story Alice is constantly tempted. Next it's the drink me potion, then you've got the caterpillar and the Mad Hatter. Because of her curiosity and she's just got a whimsical nature, she's always leaping into the next part of the story, so I wanted that to be a feature of the painting. I decided to have her falling down the rabbit hole, which is described as being lined with hundreds of cupboards and drawers with jars of honey and jam, etc., and all these different knickknacks. So I wanted her to be able to reach out to these little objects as she fell, because they're all tempting to her. I wanted her figure to appear gentle, like she's floating too. And as she's always pretty relaxed for all of this weird stuff going on, I felt like that made sense in her nature. And so to me it made sense for her and the rabbit to break the edges of the painting, to not only give this illusion of them falling through the illustration itself, but also because it gives them this weightless look, like they're travelling through the tunnel even if the image itself is stationary. Day 3, the word was universe, and this is the one day that makes a slight break from the rule I set myself. I didn't actually read The Little Prince as a kid. I read it a few years ago for the first time, as quite a few of my friends who'd come over as exchange students in college had raved onto me about how it was their favourite book growing up, and because it just seemed so universally loved by them all, pun intended I guess, I really wanted to see what that book was about. The easiest, simplest description I can think of is it's a really beautiful story of a little boy who loves a rose while he's living on a little planet out in space, which sounds really bizarre now I'm describing it, but the storytelling itself is a lot more down to earth with its message. I read recently someone critiquing literature that is written for adults at the moment. That so many of the most popular books at the moment, I think it's called non-fiction especially, is just based on everyday life and not really asking any big questions of the reader. And that adults belittle children's literature, but in general, children's literature asks much more deeper philosophical questions of its reader. I think Little Prince would be a great example of this idea. I love Roald Dahl, and though he does have elements of this too in his writing, I would say often his feels like odes to morality. This is what you should and shouldn't do. This is what makes a good or a bad person. He's a very black and white writer, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But in contrast, Little Prince leaves you feeling a little bit more unsteady, like the sand in the desert he's finding himself lost in. The writing feels a lot more open and based on feeling rather than here is my set of rules. So if you have read it, especially if you did read it as a kid, I would love to know what you thought of it back then, because, like I say, this one I read as an adult, and so I see it through those eyes, whereas other books on this list, I do distinctly remember how I felt reading them at, say, age 6. So I would love to know what you thought of it. And on day 4, the word was tales, and I found my excuse to paint a Beatrix Potter story. I think I read them all. I used to have a collection of the books as a kid. Like every kid who's read them, I do love Peter Rabbit. Maybe not that awful CGI thing they made the other year, though I haven't seen that, but I really haven't heard many good things about it. But I decided to not go with this tale and instead go with Tom Kitten's. I think the reason Tom Kitten was my favourite was definitely the streaking. No, I think it is just the idea of some little chubby kitten being dressed up in little Victorian outfits and just doing exactly what a real kitten would do, immediately taking off those lovely outfits and ruining them. And when the puddle ducks steal them, I don't know, to me this is the funniest story that she did, so I knew I wanted to illustrate that story the most. Just last year I actually went up to the Lake District and visited the hilltop, which is Beatrix Potter's home, and I had a look around, and if you have seen it, you might have noticed the home I painted in the background of this piece is meant to resemble the hilltop. On a side note, I really enjoyed painting this home, and I think I might do a series of little paintings of different buildings. Not really too sure, but I think that could be a lot of fun. So for day 5, the word was shadows. Again, I was a little tempted by a book I read as an adult, but I think I would have loved as a kid, that being Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. The monsters in that first appear like shadows in the dark, and it really tempted me to break the mould and do a much darker illustration, but the idea I had in mind felt a little bit too grand for this format that I'd made, so I changed my mind and I instead went with The Secret Garden. From the moment I read the prompt list, I knew I wanted to find a place for The Secret Garden. It's probably the book I reference the most now. Moving down here to Wales has meant seeing lots of big rural homes, and each time I visit a place like that, all I can think about is finding a secret garden. I love going for walks, and being in this new area, it's all about taking the little paths down the sides of buildings, or through this bit of forest. I love going to explore places, and The Secret Garden just speaks to this bit of me, I guess, of finding a lost place and turning it into somewhere beautiful again. I don't really want to spoil the story if you haven't read it, but there are shadows in the manor house where she lives that aren't really always visible. They're all hidden, and so I wanted them to be hidden in this illustration. It was very tempting to hide a figure in the brick or stonework, but I decided against that too in favour of just a simple random pattern. I wanted the focus to be the little girl and the flowers, but the brickwork background to kind of mess around with the painting in general and just distract your eyes away a little. It's a bit hard to explain, but I wanted it to feel almost overwhelming, so hopefully that comes across. Coming near the end, on day 6 the word was guardian. Much like with Beatrix Potter and Secret Garden, I knew I wanted to get Roald Dahl into the series, but I wasn't really sure where. The word Guardian reminded me of lots of his books, and so it's pretty hard to choose just one. I felt like The Twits or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory could have fit the bill really well, but I went with the BFG because being big, friendly giant kind of feels like a description for a guardian when you're a kid. And the fact he protects Sophie too just comes to mind. And also, if you know that Sophie, the character, was inspired by Roald Dahl's own granddaughter, that kind of relationship too has always bled through to the story for me, so it felt like the right choice. I loved the animated film as a kid, and Doodle Stuff mentioned there'd been a CGI movie recently, which I haven't seen, but unlike Peter Rabbit, they seem to have actually been affected by Quentin Blake's illustrations in a positive way. As much as I felt I was probably in this painting too, that messy, scribbly style just feels so childlike and active. It's really hard to divorce it from the story for me at least, but hopefully it can be taken as a compliment. I decided to focus on a monochromatic palette for this piece, just to give it the feeling of a still, calm night. The only objects shown to be moving are the curtains in the closest window, and I wanted that home in particular to be more noticeable than the rest, just so the viewer follows the BFG off the page away from the home where he's picked up Sophie. Again, it was a lot of fun building up the watercolours in this piece. It helped me focus on values and lighting, which is no doubt a good thing. This is the one time I used the metallic watercolours for the stars, and I mixed it into the lighthouses too. I'm not really sure if its pearlescent kind of appearance shows in the video, but it does have a really nice effect in person. You'll have to tell me what you think of it. And lastly, day 7, the word was sun. If I had to tell you my favourite book, even now, not limiting it to my childhood, but my favourite book ever is Watership Down by Richard Adams. I can't imagine most people really relate Watership Down to the animated movie, and might find it a bit odd that it could be my favourite book. I actually quite like the movie, but the book feels very significant to me in particular. I feel it's easy to say, well, they're rabbits, and act as if they're therefore silly to relate to in any way, but I would argue a hell of a lot of people are really into things like Star Wars or Twilight or Harry Potter, and those have a hell of a lot of talking characters and creatures that you can't relate to really if we're not counting rabbits, so not to be bitter, but so to me, the story is really important, especially because of Hazel. It's odd because when people talk about representation and seeing themselves in the media, I do understand that one and how it can feel so limiting, mainly because of how much I relate to Hazel. Even now, there isn't a character I relate to more than Hazel in a book. I can hear how weird this sounds, but if you've read it, maybe you can understand what I mean. Hazel is the leader of the group of rabbits, but he's not like leaders in other situations or stories that I've read. He listens and he cares about those around him. He realises what each of his group excels at and defers to their knowledge and expertise. He's humble, but he's also really brave, and he works really hard and sacrifices lots of things just to bring them all up to where he knows they can go. And I think I've always just felt a lot of responsibility too, all of which I know I've put on myself. And Hazel to me is a perfect example of responsibility done right. It's not being selfish, but it's also not blind kindness without a sense of reality. He's a very resilient and determined character, and how can he not be your favourite character? He's just too good. I think Watership Down is a great example of, if your characters are good, you'll follow them through whatever the plot is. Not that the plot of Watership Down is bad, but I would read anything where Hazel was the main protagonist. God, I could dedicate too many videos to talking about Watership Down, but I guess for this one to wrap up, I knew I wanted at least one of the illustrations to be based on this book, and Sun felt like the closest, as the rabbit god Lord Frith is often depicted as the sun, and I knew I wanted him wrapped around the sun, showing this final scene of the book. After living down in Somerset over that year, where the book is basically set, and visiting Glastonbury in particular, I knew I wanted the style of this painting to feel like the traditional crafts that you see down there. So the colours and the more loose shapes and patterns designs are all really inspired from that place. And so that was my childhood week of 2018. I think I'm going to sell these, maybe prints as well too, over on my shop if you're interested. I feel unnecessarily weird promoting my shop, but it does exist if I do so or not, so if you're interested, links in the description. I really enjoyed sticking with pencil and watercolour this week. I got kind of annoyed with myself in retrospect using ink at all, and I think I'm going to try and invest in a dip pen, just to get some nicer lines when I do want to incorporate them, and hopefully to get some practice in before October too, as we're already midway through June. And so that's it for this week. My song of the week is Yesterday by Noname. The whole Telephone album that she's done is wonderful, but I'm going to pick this as my highlight because I've been singing it all week. And my artist of the week is Elena, or Elena Ulyanova. She's an illustrator over on Instagram who made some really beautiful illustrations for Childhood Week. And I was hoping you could comment what your favourite book was when you were a kid. And do you know why it is? Did you relate to them like me, or did you have other reasons why it was your favourite? I'd love to know your thoughts, and if you had a favourite from this Childhood Week. I hope you're having a wonderful week. I've said week 500 times, but I do hope you're doing well, and I'll chat to you soon.